I write about Abbe Huc? Friends sometimes ask me, what are you working on? And I say I'm working on a set of books by a 19th century French Lazarist missionary to China in the middle of that century. And they say, well, that's rather a strange thing to be doing late in your life. Surely there are other things that are more important or interesting. Why work on this fairly unknown now character and his observations on China? To that I would hopefully answer something as follows. I've always been interested as an anthropologist in other ways of living and other philosophies and social systems, and I started working on those in Nepal for many years and then in Japan. And then recently I've switched my main attention with my wife Sarah to China. We went in 1996 for the first time, and then seriously as an anthropologist in 2002, and went there almost every year until COVID. So we've been 17 times all over China. And it is indeed an extraordinary and fascinating civilization to regard. The oldest, the most complex, the most durable, the most various, and in many ways the most sophisticated and powerful the world has ever known. Yet it's not an easy place to understand. Obviously, the fact that I don't read or speak Chinese is not a great advantage, and it's too late for me to learn those things. So my observations of China have been through standing on the shoulders of others. On each of our trips, we travel around different parts of China, often with my PhD students in the past and now with friends. And through their eyes, I see something of their lives and their views on China. I can interrogate them and ask them what this means and how they think about that. Through that kind of conversational friendship anthropology, I've learned a great deal about China. And with that help, I've been able to finally get some understanding of this great civilization. I've tried to turn that understanding into several books. One which compares four civilizations: China, Japan, Europe, and the Anglosphere, is an introduction to what I understand about China. A much longer one called Understanding the Chinese A to Z was published 3 or 4 years ago, and it looks at many different aspects of Chinese society, history, and civilization, both as an anthropologist and as a historian. But I still feel that there are great depths of China that I don't understand. One lesson I learnt from looking at Japan was that if you could find a person, a historical figure within the civilization who really understood it, because they were looking at it comparatively from both within and without, then you could get a new and fresh insight into it. And in Japan I found Fukuzawa Yukichi, a 19th century reformer who is potentially and often thought of as the founder of modern Japan, a great thinker, philosopher, social activist, inventor, and so on. And for some years I used to ask my Chinese friends, is there someone like Fukuzawa who looks at China in a very broad and comparative context and seems to get right to the heart and soul of that civilization? And they couldn't really think of anyone. They could think of several thinkers, great thinkers like Liang Qichao or Wang Guwei or other thinkers, particularly in the early part of the 20th century. But when I looked at them, they were specialist philosophers or archaeologists or historians or economists, and they understood one part of China, but not the whole thing. And likewise, when I read Western accounts by very distinguished historians and anthropologists of China, I found they gave me a portrait of one bit of China, one part of its history or one part of its culture, but not an overview. So I was still looking for this, and during the COVID lockdown, my wife picked off the shelves behind her a set of books by Abbe Evariste Huc. I'd first encountered Huc when we bought his most famous book, written with Joseph Gabet, called Travels in Tartary, Tibet and China. And these 2 volumes are an extraordinary account of one of the most daring and difficult travels ever undertaken by human beings, and is the famous work by Huc. But she also started to read this, the great 2-volume work on China itself. And when she encouraged me to read them, and I'm not sure I had read them before, I suddenly realized that this was the man who would provide for me in relation to China what Fukuzawa had done for Japan. Huc was in China for some years, about 13 years, from the late 1830s through to the time he came back. And he was clearly an outstanding linguist. He learnt Mandarin, he learnt Manchu, Mongolian, and some Tibetan. He was also very full of curiosity, and he did this extraordinary journey from the south, from Macau and the southeast up to Beijing, then through Manchuria, and then more or less by accident across to Lhasa, and then sent down by the Chinese authorities down the river back to Macau. And this long 2-year travel, as well as many other trips he made around China, gave him an insight into all levels of Chinese civilization. He lived with ordinary Chinese peasants and farmers and herders, but he also had long conversations with senior officials and mandarins and others. And he was well trained in the West, in Western philosophy, in the tradition of Montesquieu and Tocqueville, and he, as a missionary, was keen to understand the deeper soul, as it were, of China, how people thought, in particular, obviously, in relation to religion and philosophy. But he was also curious about its agrarian system, its social system, its army, everything. And he wrote beautifully, and wrote these 4 volumes about China. And when I read them, I realized that they gave a picture of China at a fascinating moment, the middle of the 19th century, when the Qing emperor was under huge pressure. It was the time of the Opium Wars, and the Taiping Rebellion was just starting. And it was the last glow of the last great imperial system of China. So he was able to observe the old China, but also get some glimpses of how it was changing into something which would evolve into the new China. And so I wrote this book based on his work, looking at China through his eyes, imagining that he was an anthropologist writing a field report on what he's discovered. And then I leaning over his shoulder, observed what he discovered. And through that, I think one can begin to see the enduring features of China, the structural, deeper grammar of China, in a way that no other writer I've come across portrays. I've looked at the other great accounts by outsiders of China. We've published one recently by Father Adriano de las Cortes, a unique account in 1625 of being shipwrecked in southern China. And that gives you the first real anthropological insight into China by a Westerner. But the others, Marco Polo and Lord Macartney and 19th century accounts of China, all are extremely valuable. But I think none of them goes down into the depths of understanding and interrogation that Huc provides. So my view of China, past, present, and guessing at the future, has been enormously enriched and expanded by looking at Abbe Huc, and I hope that yours will be too.